imagine living in our country, the example of freedom and liberty all over the world. But instead, black and white people are separated. This was a way of life around 60 years ago, and it is called segregation. It was not uncommon back then that people with black skin couldn't use the same bathroom as white people. Today, we don't think about which bathrooms are labeled for us to use. We take for granted that all we need to pay attention to is whether it says boys or girls. When it comes to segregation and civil rights, most of us think of Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X as the most influential persons. But it was Thurgood Marshall, Mr. Civil Rights, who took a stand for radical and permanent change using the law. The results of his life brought a revolutionary way to which we all live. However, he didn't use anything but what was already in place within the United States, our Constitution. For Thurgood Marshall, equal rights were for all people, no matter the color of their skin. Thurgood was born on July 2, 1908 in Baltimore, Maryland. His father, William Marshall, instilled in him an appreciation for the U.S. Constitution by taking him to courtrooms and discussing the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment reads, in part, "No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person the equal protection of laws." Thurgood sometimes hung around rough kids, and when he got in trouble at school, his principal sent him to the basement with a copy of the U.S. Constitution to read and memorize. This more than anything fostered his appreciation for the Constitution and later taking a stand against segregation. Just before he graduated from the famous historically black Lincoln University, he married his first wife, Vivian Bury. He certainly was on a promising path with a good education as he headed to law school in 1930. Marshall himself had experienced what discrimination felt like when he couldn't attend the University of Maryland Law School because he was black. Instead, he went to Howard University, the Princeton for black people at the time. There, he studied under Charles Houston. Houston installed him with a pride in who he was and that his mission in life was to be a social architect by using the law. Thurgood was at the start of his pathway to success. It became clear to Marshall that his ultimate goal would need to be overturning the famous case of Plessy v. Ferguson from 1896. This required separate but equal facilities when it came to race segregation. However, the reality of this separateness was that it was not equal. In order for fairness for all citizens, which was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, to be realized, Marshall believed the path towards this was going to be through attacking schools' enforcement of separate but equal. In reality, black people could not get equal education the way things were. 27-year-old Marshall took on the University of Maryland Law School on behalf of Donald Murray, who was denied admission because of his skin color. He was then invited in 1935 to move to New York City to become an attorney for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. There, he took on many cases to slowly engineer a move to completely eliminate the separate but equal clause from Plessy v. Ferguson. Although it was not always popular because people were afraid of the consequences, Thurgood Marshall convinced more and more black people that the law could work for them to achieve equality and was not constructed to work against them. Segregation was wrong at so many standards, including the 14th Amendment. However, separate but equal was still the law of the land. In 1952, Thurgood Marshall took on 5 cases, which collectively became known as Brown v. the Board of Education. He argued that the separation of blacks and whites was harmful to the development of black children. He brought in experts like scientists, other lawyers, and historians to support his argument. The Supreme Court understood the impact of their decision to overturn separate but equal would be for all people in the United States. So on May 17, 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren read from the precise and unanimous decision of the justices. It read in part, "The policy of separating the races causes inferiority. A sense of inferiority affects the motivation of a child to learn. This, therefore, deprives them of some of the benefits they would receive in a racially integrated school system. We conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal." Using the law, he did it. The separate treatment because of the color of your skin was no longer to be the way of life in the United States of America. However, it soon became clear, with no deadline for change, the resistance for change would linger for many years to come.
But to those of us who know that struggle is far from over, history has another lesson. It tells us how deeply rooted habits of prejudice are, dominating the minds of men and all our institutions for 3 centuries.
The case of Brown versus the Board of Education promoted the actions of other civil rights icons like Martin Luther King Jr., but it was Marshall's understanding of the Constitution and his persistence to bring a revolutionary change towards our way of living today. I asked my grandfather to explain just how different it was compared to today. He said,
"I remember stepping off a train as a young soldier in the early 60s in the Deep South. I was surprised to see a small, run-down outhouse there that was labeled colored only. I was shocked to see segregation right there in front of me."
Wow, things were really different back then.
Yes, the changing of people's minds did not come easily. The discriminatory practices from generations of people before didn't change quickly. I can also clearly remember protest marches in many cities taking place. The new rule of law wasn't the vision shared by all. In the city that I live, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a civil rights leader named Father James Groppe led his march to a face-to-face standoff with other protesters. They were marching to bring attention to the implied boundaries between the black and white parts of town that existed in our city.
Interesting, because although Marshall didn't see protesting as the tool that would bring about the change he desired, protesters in civil rights movement like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Father Groppe from your story, Papa, would not have had their purpose for protesting segregation without Thurgood Marshall changing the laws. Each method needed each other to bring the needed attention that would eventually change the minds of many.
Exactly.
There's very little truth in the old refrain that one cannot legislate equality. Laws not only provide concrete benefits, they can even change the hearts of men.
Thanks, Pops. In an email, Dr. Irvin Winsborough, professor of history and African American studies at Florida Gulf Coast University, told me Marshall's influence continued in the law when President Kennedy appointed him to the federal courts, and later President Johnson appointed him to the Supreme Court in 1967. These positions only further ensure civil rights for all people. Thurgood was the first black member to join the Supreme Court. Professor Winsborough remarked how Marshall was dedicated to the law. He stood up for the constitutional rights for all citizens and not just for the privileged few. Forced to follow rules, he didn't always agree with himself, but understood he was to be the change agent as a lawyer. He carefully used the law itself to change the system, took a stand against segregation to solidify the idea that the U.S. is a land for we the people. Thanks for watching!